There are four things that every good leader has in common. I call them the four traits of good leadership. And my favorite thing that every good leader does is they know when to move the stool. And what do I mean by that? They know when to make their team stand tall and face the fear. If you remember Muhammad Ali, in his big fights and big rounds, his trainer, in between rounds, instead of letting him sit down, would move the stool and make Ali stand tall. And what he wanted Ali to do was to know that he could do it. And also, what he was doing at the same time, when his opponent, who was also tired and probably weak, just like Ali was, when he saw that this man could stand in between rounds and not have to sit down, that mental psyche did something. And so every good leader that I know knows when to move the stool and make their teams face those fears and to stand tall, because sometimes that's victory in and of itself when you can just face the fear.
Welcome to the Live Brave podcast. I'm Margie Warrell. Here you'll learn how to live and lead with more courage in an increasingly anxious world. If you'd love to bring your bravest self to your biggest challenges and the boldest vision for your life, you are in the right place. Let's get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. I'm so glad you're joining me on the Live Brave podcast today. I'm going to be sharing with you an inspiring conversation with an extraordinary man whose childhood marked by violence, by poverty, by really just the violence that so many people experience in their own homes, didn't define who he would be as an adult, but actually became the catalyst for him to do extraordinary things. My guest is Mick Hunt. He is the author of the Unplugged podcast. He is a best-selling author. He is a speaker. He has built, scaled many multi-million dollar businesses. But the reason I wanted to speak with Mick is because of his courage, his resilience, his tenacity, and his decision not to let his greatest hardships define the adult that he would be, but in fact, to choose to define himself. And he made a promise to his mum when he was 10 years old that ultimately set his entire life on a new trajectory. And the reason I want to share Mick's story and I wanted to have a conversation with him is because I think we live in an era where there is a lot of victimhood. A lot of people have a narrative about why they can't live a life that's deeply meaningful, why they can't achieve the things that inspire them, who is to blame. And there is a distinct difference between being a victim of something and living from a victim mindset. All of us are victims in some way. We're victims to people who have behaved poorly, who have broken trust, who have committed acts of violence against us. We're victims to the economy. We're victims to parents who didn't know what they were doing, and maybe they were outright negligent. Maybe they were just lacked the knowledge, the skill, the maturity to give you what you needed in a moment in time. Maybe you're a victim right now to a really lousy boss. All of us are victims, but there is a distinct difference between being a victim and operating from a victim mindset. It is okay to own it when you have found yourself in a circumstance that feels unfair or unjust, but it is very, very important that you don't live as a victim to those circumstances, that you choose your response, that you decide who you're going to be, and you don't give away your power and your agency to those circumstances, to choose our attitude, to choose our actions, to choose our response in any given circumstance. That is the essence of what it is to live powerfully. That is where our deepest source of freedom and power reside, as Viktor Frankl, whose book I've mentioned many times, Man's Search for Meaning. Read it if you haven't yet read it yet. I know I mentioned it in the last podcast. That is where we really get the greatest source of power, in that freedom of choice. And Mick is someone who exemplifies that. And I'd like to think that, as I go through my days, every now and again, I can find myself, having one of those no good, bad, awful days. But, okay, how quickly can we pick ourselves up, reset our attitude, focus on what it is we want and not on what we don't want, what we do have, not on what we don't have, what is within our control and not what lays outside of it. So, whatever's going on in your world right now, maybe there's just some area of your life you're not feeling full agency, you're not feeling empowered and positive and purposeful, where you're creating a story. And I wrote about this in the Courage Gap. It was the second key principle to rescript what makes you feel stuck, scared, or stressed, where it might be keeping you living too small, too safe, playing yourself small, and to really recraft that story, because you create your stories, then your stories create you. Before we get on with the show, I just want to mention again my upcoming retreat with the Modern Elder Academy. It will be on a beautiful ranch just outside New Mexico, the 15th to the 19th of February. It is going to be a really powerful, life-changing, uplifting experience for everyone who joins me. It is fantastic seeing the registrations coming in. I hope if you are feeling like you could do with a reset, please check it out. There'll be a link in the show notes. I also encourage you to check out my newly released LinkedIn course called Activating Courage: How to Transform Discomfort into Bold, Confident Action. There's a lot of talk about courage. I talk a lot about why we need to be brave, but it's how you put it into practice that really makes all the difference. That's where you get the benefit of what it is to live bravely, to lead bravely, the reason I do this podcast. So check that out. There'll also be a link in the show notes. And finally, if you just want to just lift yourself up, if you haven't yet read The Courage Gap, which I also narrated, check it out. On with the show now. But I just want to wish you all that you wish for yourself as you step into 2026, a brand new year, a blank canvas. You get to decide what you write on it. As I said in the last episode, small little actions can create big changes over time. So don't overwhelm yourself with big resolutions if that just makes you feel, that takes all the wind out of you. Focus on one small thing you can do and then do that consistently, because it compounds over time. Thank you again for listening to this podcast. Of course, I hope you'll also rate and review it, share it. Now, on with my conversation with Mick. And I hope that you find it uplifting, inspiring, and that it will empower you to reclaim your agency, your ability to respond powerfully when you feel like life is coming at you. Well, Mick, thank you for joining me on the Live Brave podcast.
Dr. Margie, I'm so excited to be here with you.
Yeah, you have had quite the journey, one that has required you to practice courage many times throughout your life. And so much of your adult life has been shaped by your childhood experiences. So I think no one's going to say it better than you in your own words. Can you just take us on the journey of your childhood and that decision that you made as a 10-year-old boy?
Yeah, Dr. Margie, the first 10 years of my life, every day, I witnessed my mother go through some form of abuse, whether that was physical abuse, financial abuse, mental abuse, and sometimes even sexual abuse from my father, who lived in the same household, who was married to my mom. And it was Christmas Eve morning, 1988, and my mom was sitting at the edge of my bed, crying, as almost wailing, a sound I'd almost never heard before. But I knew exactly what that meant. And I knew what the night before was, or what the moment that it just happened was. And I said to myself, I'm not going to let this happen again. And something inside of me said, you've been saying it to yourself. You need to say it out loud. And so I said to my mom, this isn't going to happen anymore. And so I literally stood up full of rage, and I went to go punch a wall. And my mom grabbed me and she said, no, don't do that. And I said, well, just leave. Like, I can deal with my dad. I can deal with the abuse. Like, I can deal with it all. You just leave. And she wouldn't do it. And so I made a promise to her that day that I was going to change her life. And I didn't know how, I didn't know what. I had no steps. I just knew that I couldn't depend on anyone else to protect my mom and my sister and later my brother than myself. And so I'd like to say I made a decision to no longer be a 10-year-old child and to be a man, to be an adult. And that changed the course of my mindset, that changed the course of the actions and decisions that I made. And more importantly, um, it put a plan in place for me to protect my mother. And so that's what I did. And so the 10-year-old me became a grown man me. Not physically, but again, emotionally and mentally, I became a man.
Yeah, that's a lot for a 10-year-old. When you think back at that 10-year-old boy who, you know, chose to, like, just you were no longer you felt like you no longer could afford the indulgence of
Yeah.
childhood in one sense. You know, as you think back on what that younger version of yourself, was feeling at that time, there must have been a host of different emotions, and yet you really chose to focus in on the impact that you wanted to make, and it gave you a huge sense of purpose. But talk to me about how fear shaped the decisions you made from that point on.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the big fear was letting my mother down, was letting people that depended on me down. And, a lot of times people look at fear as negative. Fear is an emotion, right? And all emotions are really focused on how do you deal with or understand that emotion at that time. And so for me, fear became a friend. And when I was facing fear or when I might have thought I was fearful, I used that to channel to go to another place. And here's an example of that. So, Dr. Margie, what I realized was my dad had triggers. And when those triggers happened, usually that means he responded in a different way. And so I would just take the triggers and put them on me and not my mom. Right. So when I could feel or sense that he was doing something where I would be fearful was, "Hey, I don't want this directed at my mom. I'd rather it be directed at me." And so for me, that's what fear became. It became a place that I could go to go to another level. I don't want people to think that fear is always bad. It's an emotion, and how do you deal with that emotion? And more importantly, how do you use fear to your point, to what I love about your show is to drive impact. And so for me, every time I saw that, I knew that I had to go to a place of impact.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And I should just say, please don't feel the need to say Dr. Margie. You can just call me Margie.
Understood.
Yeah,
Understood.
I love that framing of fear, and it aligns so much with my own experience. Like, fear is an emotion. It's an emotion that tells us how we're interpreting what's going on around us. It's wired into us. We can't not have it.
Mhm.
It is, we emote before we even reason. And yet, so often we give fear the negative power. It keeps us from doing the things that would expand our future, that would help us
Mhm.
to be a greater source of good in the lives of others. And yet we can use it. It is the most powerful lever of transformation, of growth, of impact. And I kind of comes back that old fashioned saying of, make your mission bigger than your fear. But by the same time, we can reframe it and go, what is it I'm afraid you're not that I don't want to happen? And how do I channel it that way? And which for you, obviously you did, time and time again too. And I'm curious, as you went through your teenage years, you were dealing with a whole lot of stuff that a whole lot of teenage kids don't have to deal with. And that obviously, I'm sure there was many experiences through that. But tell me, what was the journey that led you to the work you do today that empowers others to lead with greater purpose, to lead from the inside out,
Mhm.
starting with themselves? What was that journey, and how did your fear continue to shape you, but also build your courage? Because of course, there is no courage without fear.
No, absolutely. And for me, Today we call it emotional intelligence. When I was a teenager and even in college, my early years, I don't know if emotional intelligence or EQ was the trendy term, but I was very cerebral. I really started to understand not just my emotions, but the emotions of others. And so again, I got to see, what I hate the term trigger, but what emotions were brought on by certain actions in a lot of people. And so as a teenager, I started to dial in on that. And so I'm not going to say that my journey was different or worse than other people. I think we have a lot of superstars and superhuman beings that are in the world. Again, I was just able to channel those emotions and to be courageous to do things. And so the teenage me was really focused on being a doctor or a lawyer because if I was going to change my mom's life and get her out of harm's way, the only thing that I knew was what I saw on TV. Right. I knew that I probably couldn't be an actor. I probably couldn't be an entertainer, but I could go to school and be really, really smart. And so that became my thing. And so I was going to be a doctor or a lawyer until I was talking to a doctor one day. And, growing up, most of the doctors in my hometown were the practice was called the whatever side of town that was. So West Side Dentistry or West Side Chiropractic, because that was the west side of town. Well, I go to this one doctor and the practice is his name. And I said, "Wait, so you actually own this?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, can you explain the difference of being a doctor and being a business owner?" And he was very blunt with me. He said, "Yeah, the big difference is people get paychecks. I get to sign them." And that resonated with me. And so at that moment, I knew that I needed to be an entrepreneur. Um, I was so fascinated with owning. And so I went to college, studied business and communications, went and got an MBA as well. And I realized that in order to change my mom's life, to change my sister and brother's life, to fulfill that promise that I made to them, was I was going to own a business. Now, did that mean at 22 years old, the first thing I was going to do was start a business? No, because I had bills like everyone else. And so I knew that I was going to work for someone else and help them build their business and build their dreams. But then at that point, I said, I'm going to do this on my own. And for me, quite honestly, that's where leadership really played a play when the decisions that I make affect those who work with me. It made me think much different. So I've always been very cerebral. But now the promise that I made to my mom and to my brother and sister, I have to keep that same promise to 30 employees. I have to keep that same promise as my business grows to 300 employees. Because every decision that I make, the vision that I have, no longer just impacts me, it impacts others. And so you talk about fear, right? You talk about decision making. Like, all right, it sounds great to add this piece of technology, but now I might have to cut an employee to do that. Or I'm gonna have to make for darn sure that this technology can pay for itself because I'm not going to cut an employee or let an employee go. So decisions like that, decisions on who do I partner with, right? You know, Margie, I'm not putting doctor in there this time. Margie and I might want to do a brand deal. Well, what's her reputation? Does her reputation align with where I'm going in my reputation? Promoting people to leaders within the organization. Did I make the right decisions? Fear took on a different meaning for me, when I became the business owner. When the decisions that I made affected 300 people, it was a different type of fear. But you still have to be courageous. You still have to make those decisions. And like, I know everybody that's watching or listening to this episode, no matter who you are, no matter what your position is, no matter what you do for a living, I promise you, you are about to make a decision, right? The decisions in life don't stop. You've got to be courageous enough to make the decision. And to me, that goes with preparation. And that's one of my pillars is I'm prepared to make decisions. And we can segue there or go there or whatever. But again, that was my journey from 10-year-old to kind of where I am today.
Yeah, part of that journey is just a deep commitment to having integrity, to operating with character.
Mhm.
Uh, my guess is that you often saw significant deficits of it in your father. And and perhaps that's what maybe even galvanized strength and deepened your commitment to being a man of character. And yet character, the times we most need to practice it is when it's the most difficult to practice, uh, when it costs us something. And I'm curious to know, as you've gone along, you talked a moment ago about, do I have to cut someone or do I just keep them on and make this work? When it comes to running a business, but even people who are in, big companies, doing the right thing, what we believe is the right thing, is easier said than done, because often it does cost us something. There's
Mhm.
something we have to give up. Maybe it's a short-term win. Maybe it's the harmony of the group. Maybe it's, some status we might have got, or an opportunity that would have, been a really fun thing to do, but we don't sense it's the right thing to do. Can you give me an example of a time when you kind of found yourself like, there was some sense of, what is the right thing to do here? And it was a hard decision to make. And maybe you made it and maybe you didn't make it. Either way, I'm curious to know, what was your learning, and how might that be of value to those who are listening going, you know what, how do I know what is the right thing to do in a situation where sometimes it's a little gray. It's not always like bleedingly obvious.
Yeah, I'll give you probably one of the, I'll say, toughest decisions that I made. Um, that I would say anybody that's a leader on this call has gone through at least once. Um, I needed to hire or promote to a senior position. And there's someone who'd been on my team who'd been with me for 8 years who probably knew me better than anyone else in the world knew me. But in the interview process, someone was better. Someone from the outside was better. And I knew that that someone on the outside was a better candidate. So you talk about all the emotions. How do I tell this person who I've been grooming to be my right hand that someone is a little bit better suited for what the company needs? And so I had to segment what was right for the company versus what was right for friendship, or for, making me feel good with the decision I was going to make. So to your point, every decision isn't easy, because the easy thing would have been to promote this person. So for me, it was twofold. The person from the outside was a better fit. The person that I worked with for 7 years knew me better than anyone. So I wasn't going to have to explain a lot, right? I wouldn't have to explain my decisions. I wouldn't have to explain projects. I could just let this person run. But again, they were not ready. And so I had two different types of fear of kind of the unknown, but then fear, can I train someone who doesn't know me but has the amazing skill sets, right? Um, so to make a long story short, I did end up hiring the person from the outside because it was the right thing for the company, right? It was the right thing for the company. I was able to explain to the person that I didn't promote from within exactly why, because I believe every good leader should be fully transparent. And once that transparency happened, a relief came over me, because what I was more fearful of wasn't training someone new. It wasn't the unknown. What my real fear was telling this person who's known me forever that they were not going to get the job. That's what I really was afraid of. But it took having that conversation to realize, oh, okay, I'm not afraid of training someone new because we have all the resources to do that. I'm not really afraid of the unknown because we face unknown every day. And so for me, it helped me understand how to not only channel fear, but understand what real fear is. Because a lot of times what we assume is fear, what we put as a broad picture of fear,
Hmm.
there's usually one specific thing that we're really
Yeah.
fearful of.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that story. It's such a great example of what courage looks like too. And so often, people that I talk to, particularly, I feel like courage is often needed, Mick, in the relational realm,
Mhm.
in our connection, our communication, and conversations with other people. And that's a perfect example of that. So often, people will give all sorts of reasons of, I can't do this or that or the other. So often, if you pull it back and keep peeling off those layers, it's, I'm afraid of what someone will think. I'm afraid of a relationship fallout. I'm afraid of discord. I'm afraid of something in our connection to other people. And yet we can't always identify that. So I think, you taking yourself through that exercise, and it's often, if you get really granular, there is this moment where we feel incredibly awkward and vulnerable. And we maybe are sharing something with someone, and we know that in that moment, they're just feeling a kick in the guts. Even though he respected your decision and he knew you, it was still, I'm sure, a really disappointing moment for him.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and you had to just sit with him in that moment. And it's
Oh,
often not just about what they're feeling, but I don't want to have to be with this person as they're feeling it. I'm like, yeah, let's face it, it's often about us too. So,
yeah, yeah. But if you never face those moments, right, you leave things somewhat unsaid, right? You leave people to walk down their own path of logic and understanding that could be vastly different from the truth. And so, yeah, it was a very tough conversation, but it was one that I knew I was going to need to have. And here's the beauty of it, Margie. He appreciated it. At the end of the day, it also has made him a better leader because now he leads a 1,000-person company, right? And he comes to me quite often. I'm still a mentor of him and says, me seeing you go through that situation with me helped me understand how to do this moving forward. And he also said it helps him create a barrier of attachment to team members, right? Because he knew how hard that was for me to go through it. But he respected the fact that I did because I could have done what was safe. I could have done what was easy, which a lot of times when we face tough decisions or when we see fear, we immediately retreat to safety. I could have done the safe thing. I could have probably even done the popular thing by promoting him, but it wouldn't have been best for the company at that time.
yeah, and that was so clear. A key sort of principle I have is that we should lead from our values and not our emotions.
Mhm.
And you were really leading from your values there.
Right.
And when we are leading from our values, not emotions, it actually emboldens us to do the brave thing, the courageous thing, to rise above the fear of all those what ifs, right?
Yeah.
And I know so much of your work is around how do we lead more effectively, and
Mhm.
the importance of leading with head and heart right now, for from leaders in today's modern workforce. I'm curious, can you just share with me a little bit about how do you frame the key principles for modern leadership?
Yeah, I've studied leaders a lot. I'm a historian, and to me, there are 4 things that every good leader has in common. I call them the 4 traits of good leadership, and I say the word good because great is always someone's opinion of you. Personally, you can do good and strive to be good, right? Great is always someone's opinion. So there's 4 traits of good leadership. And the first one is every good leader I've ever studied is always present, meaning they're available. They're purposefully, intentionally out and about with their team. They're always present. It was a popular thing in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s to have an open door policy. Anytime you need me, my door is always open. Well, in 2025 and 2026, if you have an open door policy, the only reason someone's going to come in that door is to give you a resignation letter. If you're not present as a leader, if you're not emotionally and physically available, no one's coming in that open door. The second thing that every good leader that I studied ever did is they know their teams better than their teams know themselves, meaning they get to know their people. They ask their people questions. They put them in situations and environments to win because they know their better qualities. They know their best qualities. The third thing that every good leader does is they speak less, but say more. We're in an age where words matter. We're in an age where, Margie, I don't know if you have children or if you have nieces, you have four. You probably had to text message from them, right? I have no idea what my kids say when they text message me. But we're in an environment now where you need to speak less but say more. So make your words matter. Make your words very intentional. Make them very true because that's what your employees, that's what the modern society appreciates. And then the last thing, which is my favorite thing that every good leader does that I've studied, is they know when to move the stool. And what do I mean by that? They know when to make their team stand tall and face the fear, right? Which is why I love that we're having this conversation. For those that are listening or watching, if you remember Muhammad Ali in his big fights and big rounds, his trainer, in between rounds, instead of letting him sit down, and move the stool and make Ali stand tall. And what he wanted Ali to do was to know that he could do it. And also, what he was doing at the same time, when his opponent, who was also tired and probably weak, just like Ali was, when he saw that this man could stand in between rounds and not have to sit down, that mental psyche did something. And so, every good leader that I know knows when to move the stool and make their teams face those fears and to stand tall, because sometimes that's victory in and of itself when you can just face the fear.
I love that metaphor, move the stool. Last week, I was at a conference with Daniel Goleman, who wrote the book on emotional intelligence. I know that you're
Hmm.
deeply steeped in that body of work as well. And
Hmm.
he shared many insights, but something he said that I felt was just rung so true is that one of the key roles of leaders today, and honestly, I think this applies for those who are listening that may not identify as a leader as such in a big organization or a small one, but even as a parent, is the management of fear in an organization, which starts with managing the fear in ourselves and moving the stool away so that people have to stand tall and face that fear is so critical to me. That is a key skill, the ability to help people face the unknown, the uncertainty, to reel in so much of that what if catastrophizing and fear casting that can drive people to paralysis, just an indecision, and an overwhelm, and they're not able to think straight. They much less innovate and experiment and collaborate across silos and try new ways of doing things and say, I don't know, or I got it wrong, or can I have help? And so,
Hmm.
that moving the stool so that people, stand tall connects people also to just their own innate resourcefulness. That
Absolutely.
you got this, and I believe that you got this. And when Ali's coach, I've never heard that story, but he's like, yeah, you can do this. You don't need to sit down because you're bigger than that. And I know you
Hmm.
can meet this moment and you meet your opponent too. Thank you for sharing that. If you don't mind, Mick, I'm going to be sharing that one myself at times. I think it's an awesome metaphor. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Another add to that, when George Foreman came out of retirement the second time when he was fighting in his 40s, he said, I'm going to take that. And he stood between rounds too. He wanted to face his fears. He's like, hey, I'm an old man and I want everyone to understand that I'm facing my fears. So he stood in between rounds because Ali did.
That is really powerful. I think for anyone listening right now, regardless of what you do for a living and how you fill your days, if you think about that, what does it look like for you right now to move the stool? To take away something that may be giving you a sense of safety or security or it's a way to kind of get out of just stepping up, stepping forward and facing something that needs to be faced. Because I think moving the stool is something we don't only do for others, we can do for ourselves. That
Mhm.
which is brings us to self-leadership. And I know you talk a lot, Mick, in your work about leading ourselves first, which is I mean, to me, it's the heart. How well we lead others will always be determined by how we lead ourselves. And my own work with people running big organizations and entrepreneurs running small organizations and everything in between is, we rise because of what we do. We're smart and we're ambitious and we're creative and we're tenacious, etc. But there comes a point in our journey where we also limit ourselves because of who we are. And if we haven't done the inner work, like looked inside ourselves and said, you know, what is it that I'm most afraid of? What is it
Mhm.
that triggers the deepest sense of insecurity? Who is it that I most want to be, not just in this job, but in my life? Then we are so often governed by our fears, governed by our insecurities, governed by, you know, avoiding those things that make us feel vulnerable. And so I'd just love to hear, your take on what it means to lead yourself first.
Yeah, you said it so eloquently at the beginning. You can't lead others if you can't lead yourself. And so I attach that to the first two pillars of emotional intelligence, which are self awareness and self regulation. If you don't know who you are in any scenario, in any decision making, in any project building, if you don't know who the core of yourself is, then that's going to be a challenge. And so, in order to first self lead, you have to be self aware. You have to know, well, why do I think this way? Why do I feel this way? Because a lot of times we take for granted the emotions that we have and when those emotions show up. So it's really important to understand why those things happen. And then the second part of that is the self regulation. So when you know who you are, how do you, what I call, do the right thing, say the right thing, and impact the right way? Right? It's really quick. This happens all the time. You get an email and you don't like the tone of the email or you don't like the message of the email and you want to just write it right back, right? You want to respond quickly and let everybody know how you're thinking, how you're feeling. You can't do that. You got to regulate those emotions so that people will want to follow you. When I first started in business, Margie, it was, hey, I wear my emotions on my sleeves. You can't do that now, right? You can't wear your emotions outwardly on your sleeves. Again, you got to lead yourself. You've got to control yourself. You've got to regulate yourself. And once you can do that, once you know who you are, the next thing is to make sure the most visible thing about you are your core values. I work with leaders and CEOs across the United States and internationally on building their brand. And their brand is nothing but their core values. So once you know who you are, why you do the things that you do as a leader, the most visible thing you can have are your core values and it's attached to your leadership. And that's what people then know about you. And so for me, that's self leadership. It's those three things mesh together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're also living in a time where people spend so much time operating, living, communicating from behind devices, behind screens. And I think particularly the younger generation that, the digital natives that grew up on devices and screens that have been able to avoid sometimes the deeply human work of
Hmm.
communicating effectively, of,
Hmm.
seeing someone in person and saying, will you go out with me or come to the prom with me when you're 16? Or I don't want to go out with you anymore. Like the things that were really awkward. And now we can text or send them a whatever message on Instagram or whatever to just avoid those moments. And so that self-regulation piece where and I wrote about this in my book, The Courage Gap. We are living actually in the safest time in human history to be alive, but we
Hmm.
are also living in the most anxious, fractured time in human history where people are feeling more alone. And where that regulation piece, managing our emotions, because courage isn't
Mhm.
just acting in the presence of fear, it's managing your own anxiety levels. That's something a lot of people struggle with. And so I'm curious, obviously I mean, I don't know how old you are, Mick, but I'm guessing you weren't born in, 1997. But when those of us who grew up in a time when, like, we went through our teen years and there wasn't devices that just kept us glued, etc. But what helps you to regulate when you do find yourself feeling a little out of, not on your game? And what have you seen is helpful to others, particularly younger people who, my experience is, have really got to master this aspect of themselves if they're going to be effective in the workforce.
No, I love that question and I appreciate that question. You're you're bringing up a topic that I spent an hour talking to my good friend Scott Galloway about just this week. There's some startling numbers for men that if you don't leave the house by the time you're 21, you won't leave until you're like 30. And by leaving, like, get outside, go on dates. It's some startling facts. So what do? I get outside,
Mm.
Margie. I'm not a naturalist by any stretch of the imagination. But there are moments that I just need nice fresh air. There are moments where I disconnect. I mean, and I practice it daily, honestly, where I have time that I'm intentional for my family because as leaders in our workplace, I'm sure a lot of us that are listening work 60 hours a week or you travel a lot and you don't have the time to be present at home like you do in the workplace. So one of the things that I do is every day that I'm home, I make sure that I have time where I'm not on the device for at least an hour. On the weekends, I try to only be on my device for an hour or devices for an hour. So for me, that's a lot of the self regulation is to be intentional and purposeful
Hmm.
because we can make excuses. We can put ourselves in traps. So there's two things that I do. The first one is I try to be sometimes one with nature. Again, I'm not a naturalist, so I don't. My wife loves hiking and swimming. Like I can't do either of those things, right? I can't hike without being tired, and I don't know how to swim. But I like being outdoors. There's something about sun that does some type of mental relaxation. So
Uh-huh.
I like being outside, and that's a big thing. But then I'm purposeful about putting my devices away.
Yeah, I think that
Um,
I love that. I love how I actually really love that, an hour a day and on weekends only an hour a day. Yeah, because it's a neat little it's just neat, just an hour a
well,
day. And is there
yeah,
an hour a day that most people listening that you are just not intentionally not on a device, not because you're just doing something else, but it's digital free time. But
yeah.
particularly
Oh,
sorry.
I was just gonna say on the weekends, I make my phone do this crazy thing that most people don't realize. I just make it be a phone. Like someone can call me, right? But I'm not gonna go on social media. I'm not gonna do a ton of texting, but it'll still ring. And but what it does is it allows me personally to work on communication because those are things we have to continuously evolve. So, I'm gonna say, hey, why don't you come over? Why don't we meet somewhere or something like that and not make it a text rabbit hole of this or that or a social media rabbit hole.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. And Scott's work you just referred to, your friend Scott Galloway, and I'm a huge fan of his work because I think he just shines the spotlight with a lot of extraordinary data
Yeah.
to substantiate what honestly everything he says. I like it intuitively. I'm like, yep, 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 yep.
Mhm.
I have 4 children in their 20s, Mick, three sons, and I'm really, really, honestly, I have a grateful heart saying they're all doing great. They're all just
Yeah.
good men in the world. For everything I did wrong as a parent and for all of my lapses between my husband and I, I'm like, clearly I got a few things right because they're just
There you
was
go.
young men in the world who are fully engaged in life and not spending it either at home or in, bedrooms on a phone. But
Yeah.
I do hear of so many stories because a lot of my friends have kids in their 20s, kids that are struggling and aren't thriving, and not just men, sometimes young women too. And I just think they've come of age in a world that is much more complicated than the
Mhm.
world that I came of age in. And so that's why I think it's so important from an early age to be helping them build up some of the muscles and the skills, when they're 9 and 10 and 11 and 12 that set them up for 14, 15, and 16 that set them up for
Mhm.
20 and 21. It
Mhm.
starts early, and parents have to be so much more conscientious today. And if you're just letting your kids sit on a phone because it makes your life easier, there will be a price to be paid for that down the
Mhm.
line. Not that I'm, trying to be a purist here with devices, far from it, but just to be so intentional. But just moving on from that, and before we just finish up, something that I want to just ask you about as you think about the future, the world we're living in, that is more polarized than any time I've ever known it. I live just outside Washington, D.C., Mick. So I'm sort of right now, I'm hoping it ends soon. But as we record this, there's been a big government shutdown. Obviously, flights are now delayed, etc. So just speaking to the level of, I share that just because of the level of dysfunction we're seeing in government,
Mhm.
but socially, communities, friendships, etc. There's just a lot of angst out there wherever you sit on the political spectrum, and I don't want to kind of get into a debate on that. But as you look toward the next few years and think about what does it take for we as humans in a world that is Gen AI coming in, the mass layoffs we're hearing, there is a lot of fear.
Mhm.
There's a lot of uncertainty. So, to me, in times of uncertainty, we have to triple down on what we are certain about, the values that we want to live our lives by, who it is we want to be. And, because that's what we can control. What do you think people need to be doing more of and less of to be able to thrive, adapt, and create meaningful lives where there's connection with other people, over the years ahead when, it's only going to get messier and it's only going to get faster.
Yeah, I have these conversations with my children weekly. I think people are going to have to start understanding AI, right? I think we're gonna have to start learning it, studying it, all the different facets of what's coming in because it's not going anywhere. We can complain about it. We can wish that it would go away, but it's only going to get better. Technology is only going to improve. But what's never, ever, ever going to be replaced is human interaction. And
Mhm.
so, why do you need to learn AI and understand it more? So that you can understand the humanality of it and how to make it that human connection that we're always, as mammals, gonna crave. Right? Like that's our nature, our DNA is to crave human interaction. And so that's what we're gonna have to do. We're gonna have to embrace it and understand it and how it can help us to humanize things better for us. Like perfect example. If I were to say, hey, Margie, your flight's delayed, you're gonna have to call Delta or American Airlines. Well, don't ever call American Airlines. But you got to call. That's fear. No one wants to call 1-800 customer service, right? None of us do. But when we have to, what do we want? We want that nice voice that simply is going to empathize with us, no matter what the situation is. So that's part two. Part one is understanding AI so that it can help us because maybe I can go to AI or go to 1-800, whatever, answer a few questions. And if I really need a human, then I get the human. So if I get the human, here's the second part of what we need to do. We need to learn how to communicate better. I think our society communicates very minimally. Um, and I don't know. why, how that happens, but I think all of us can communicate emotionally better. So that would be the thing. And you asked the second part of the question. What do we wish? What do I don't want to see?
Yeah.
What
What do
was
we
the
need to do less of that we're doing right now?
complaining?
That's good.
And here's why. The social media algorithms are driving fear to you. So the things that you complain about are the things that it's going to start showing you. Um, again, I don't care where you sit politically either, right? I literally sit right in the middle. I'm a registered independent, so I can say that. But when you sit on the other side, or when you sit on one or the other sides, you see things that drive that emotion of the other side, right? And what do? We complain about it. So we need to complain less.
Yeah. I remember a guy, Wayne Dyer. I don't know if you know who he is, he's passed away.
Mhm.
But he used to say, don't complain to anyone about a problem unless there's someone who can actually fix it. Otherwise, just let it go. And while I get sometimes you might argue it's okay to have a little vent here and there, I would say just what you focus on expands. And when you're just focused on what you don't want and what you can't do and what's wrong, it just takes up a lot of mental, emotional, spiritual energy real estate that just like
Yes.
that's all of that time and energy that you just spent is not going into something that you can improve, can fix. So just yeah, I think spare yourself and spare everybody else around you because it doesn't add any value and just sucks a lot of energy and oxygen out of the room. Um,
Agree.
Mick, we could talk a lot longer about many other things. You have a lot of insight, wisdom, and to that little 10-year-old boy that's still living inside you, I would just say you should be very, very proud of the man you went on to become because he made a big decision that day and look at who you are and the lives you're impacting. And I'm really glad that our lives have come to intersect with each other, Mick. So thank you for your
Uh,
time today. And I'm honored.
Thank you. You literally just made my day. That was the best thing anybody's told me today. Thank you so much for that.
Oh, my pleasure, Mick. All right, you take care and I look forward to staying in touch.
You got it. Thank you.